Quartered safe out here is George MacDonald Fraser's memoir of his experiences as a young soldier in the British Army during World War II's Burma campaign. Blending humor and stark realism, Fraser vividly recounts life on the front lines, capturing the camaraderie and harsh realities of war. With only 140 miles to go to Rangoon, Gramas was triumphantly vindicated. We leapfrogged over 5th Division at a place called Pew, and now the road was clear except for the last Japanese bastion at Pegu, 100 miles farther south, and the monsoon was still a fortnight away. Delight and excitement ran through the division, and when Punch Cowan's jeep was seen on the road, with the black cat fluttering on its bonnet, he passed to the kind of reception that generals must dream about, with his men cheering and hammering on the sides of the trucks. We hadn't seen him since the start of the year, at Ranchi, and I remember thinking, as he drove through somewhere about Penwigon, how old he looked, with his silver hair and the hooked nose that gave him his nickname. But he was grinning like a schoolboy. We were almost there. There were portents of impending final victory. Parties of British and American prisoners of war, turned loose by the retreating Japanese, were being reported, and one day an American flyer wandered into our position. I have no idea of the date. He had been several months in Japanese hands and had escaped somewhere near Rangoon and set out north. He was in a fair old state, and when the master Jippo put porridge and a fried breakfast in front of him, he burst into tears and, according to an eyewitness, buried his head in the bosom of the nearest soldier and kept repeating, "Oh boys, boys," while they assured him he was all right now. Hatred of the Japanese rose a notch higher, and this was before we knew about the horrors of the River Kwai and the Mulmain Railway. The battalion took a prisoner to about 10 miles north of Pegu, in a combined attack with the Gurkhas on a Japanese position from which the enemy withdrew during the opening barrage, leaving one unfortunate who was found hiding under a blanket. My one memory of Pegu town is of a dirty, potholed road leading to a metal-girded bridge across a swollen brown river. The Japanese were well dug in, and there was some stiff fighting for the town, but we took no part in it and were still on the wrong side of the river when the leading elements of the division had fought their way over. But it would only be a matter of hours before we were all across, guns, tanks, and men. The Japanese were reported to be pulling out. The last few miles to Rangoon would be wide open, and there would be nothing to do but motor down to the sea and the golden Shui Dagon, that Bonnie Kirka set we rubies braw, and wait, in our imagination, for the big boats to India and home. Then, 2 weeks early, the monsoon broke. The section was in a jungly clearing, brewing up, when it began. There had been a few showers in the previous week, and it had been one of those dull, steamy days when breathing is an effort, and the sweat runs off you in buckets, but the official wisdom was that we would be snug in Rangoon before the real downpour set in. I was in the act of bending over the brew tin, stirring in the leaves, when the first big drops landed in the boiling water, and I looked up in the gathering dusk at a sky that had suddenly turned dark grey and seemed to be descending slowly. There were cries of disgust and alarm, and repetition of the section's favorite four-letter word, and then it hit. If you haven't seen the monsoon burst, it's difficult to imagine. There are the first huge drops, growing heavier and heavier, and then God opens the sluices, and the jets of 1,000,000 high-pressure hoses are being directed straight down. The deluge comes with a great roar, crashing against the leaves and rebounding from the earth for perhaps a minute. After that, the earth is under a skin of water which looks as though it's being churned up by buckshot. Before you know it, you are sodden and streaming, the fire's out, the level in the brew tin is rising visibly, and the whole clearing is a welter of soaked, blaspheming men trying to snatch arms and equipment from the streams coursing underfoot. The din is deafening, partly from the storm and partly from Gramas's stentorian bellowings. "Get the tent before we drown. Come on, you idle buggers, give us a hand." The tent, a massive mildewed slab of canvas and cord, was in the truck, and it took 4 men to drag it out and carry it to the clearing. Fortunately, the ground was uneven, and there were a few raised areas on which to pitch it once we had got it unfolded, something which had not been done since its issue long before. In the interval, and especially since the first showers, it had become home to assorted jungle crawlies, spiders, leeches, and worms, and to as splendid a specimen of the myriapod of the class Chilopoda as I ever hoped to see. The giant centipede is exactly like the little amber beastie found in civilized gardens, except that he is literally 20 times bigger. This baby was just short of 16 inches, with a body as thick as a golf ball, and when he scuttled out with his pincers to the fore and his myriad legs going like the oars of a galley, the section dispersed at speed. He snaked out onto the muddy ground and took stock of his position, and I for one was on the top of the grub box with a single bound. "Don't go near it," shouted Morton, as if anyone wanted to. "The buggers are poisonous. If he nips you, you've had it." "That's nonsense," said Nick, keeping his distance. "There's nothing to worry about unless he gets on you. Don't try to brush him off backwards, or he'll dig his claws into you, And there are hundreds of them, and they'll fester. Hit him up the arse and he'll fall off head first. Hit him up the arse yourself, cried Watty. Bye, will you look at the ugly sod? That's it, Tomo lad, hit him with your knife. Corporal Peel had drawn his machete and was approaching the brute warily, for when it scuttled, it moved like lightning. He took a swipe and missed, jumping back as little many legs shot in his direction, and then it changed its mind and scurried to the grub box, nestling in at one side while I left precipitately at the other. But I'm proud to say that even in my haste, I hadn't lost sight of the interests of zoology. Wait, hold on, I cried. Don't kill it. It must be about 2 feet long, my God, I'll bet it's a record. If we can bottle the bugger, and preserve it in petrol, it could be sent home to a museum. We might even, I added hopefully, appealing to their better instincts, sell it. No kidding, the imperial science people would give their back teeth for it. I can only say that it seemed a good idea at the time, but the weight of opinion was against me, crying balmy bugger, and suggesting that I catch and bottle it myself. By then, it was too late. Peel had bisected it neatly, but the top part continued to wriggle until he hit it again, after which it was beyond repair. I still think it was a pity because when I measured the pieces the next morning, without touching them, they amounted to almost 3 times the amount of tropical centipede previously known to science, 6 inches being the norm according to the encyclopedia. It was a genuine monster, and possibly lethal, for all centipedes are poisonous to some degree, and if size is anything to go by, that one was in the cobra class. But the vandals destroyed it, and it seemed to me a judgment on them when the tent proved to be rotten at the seams, falling apart when we stretched it. We stood about in the pouring rain, damning the government, and to make matters worse, the truck, in or under which we could have found shelter, was sent off on some equipment ferrying business or other. So we spent the night under bushes, sleeping in 6 inches or so of warmish water, all except Grandmas, who lay out in the open, beaming contentedly up at the downpour and exclaiming, "Aye, grand growing weather." Strange to tell, I never slept better. In a hot climate, there's something soothing about sodden clothing and a blanket that's 9 parts water, so long as you don't sleep on your face because that way you drown. It rained steadily for about a week, but in the first 12 hours, the Pegu River had risen to an uncrossable level, and the bridge approaches turned into a morass in which no vehicles could operate. The airfields were rained out of commission, and the drive south came to a squelching halt. We began a month on half rations, which I have to say I don't remember, so it can't have been a great privation, presumably because we eked out our issue food with bananas, mangoes, and whatever else that company of expert foragers could win from the waterlogged countryside. But short rations, the incessant downpour, and the impossibility of keeping dry were small matters beside the news which dropped like a bombshell on the division just 2 days after the rain started. We were not going to Rangoon. It had been taken by seaborne assault while we were held up in the monsoon mud. The old division that had endured the retreat 3 years before, had been in the thick of the great battle that stopped the Japanese at the gates of India, and had led the way south, was denied the ultimate prize at the last minute. I couldn't complain. I was a newcomer, but even I felt disappointed, and to the old sweats like Nick and Grandmas and Forster, who had soldiered through the Burma War, it seemed like a betrayal, and hit them harder than their commanders ever knew. It may seem a small, selfish thing. The taking of Rangoon was what mattered, not who took it. But soldiers have a strong primitive sense of fairness. No one had promised them Rangoon, but they felt there had been an understanding, and it had been broken. And that wasn't the half of it. As though to add injury to insult, we were ordered back up the road which we had just come down, to deal with whatever was left of the Japanese armies. In blunt terms, no big boats, just a return to the war. How other parts of the division reacted, I can't say, but for a little while the atmosphere in 9 section was mutinous, in the everyday rather than the military sense. No one publicly flung down his hat and belt and announced, in the immortal words of the Army Act, "I'll soldier no more, you may say what you please." But looking back, in the knowledge that British troops did mutiny more than once in the last war, I can say that I'd have hated to see the section any closer to the edge than they were that morning. It was just talk, but it was ugly while it lasted, and I report it for what it was worth. We had found ourselves a basha to live in by now, a neat little one-roomed wooden bungalow on stilts which raised it above the level of the flooded ground, and when Peel came in with the word that we were going north again there was a long moment of disbelief in which the only sound was the steady roaring of rain on the palm thatch. We just stared at each other, and then the swearing and raging began, and Forster threw aside the rifle he had been cleaning and shouted, "They're not getting me up that bloody road again. I'm not going. No then. Bugger the lot of them." He fulminated on, while everyone else sat glum and paid no heed, for it was only the Forster we knew and loved giving vent to his feelings, but when he suddenly rounded on us, demanding, Are you lot gonna stand for it, then? Are you? I was startled to hear Grandma's, from whom I'd have expected a shrug of resignation, say in a grim harsh voice, "It's a bad business. By Christ, it's a bad business." "Bad business?" cried Forster. "It's a bloody stab in the back. That's what it is. Well, they can stuff it, bastard Louis Mountbatten and all." "It's not fair," said Stanley, and everyone looked at him, for Stanley was not given to opinions. "They told us we were going to Rangoon," he went on, going red under the general scrutiny. "That's what they said." "Lying bastards," said Watty. "They'll tell you anything, and then drop you in the muck. I've about had it, me." And he stood up, looking about as though for support. "And me," roared Forster. "Well, I'm not going. Not one bloody step." I expected someone to say, "Wrap up, Forster," or give it a rest, but no one spoke except Wedge, reminding us bitterly that we'd been told we'd be relieved at Maketeelaw by 5th Division, and the buggers had never arrived, and Morton who repeated with furious oaths what Stanley had said, we'd been promised we were going to Rangoon. "Well, you ain't, my son," said Parker flatly. "So you can forget it." "Rubbish." This was Forster again. "You can forget it, Parker, but I'm not." He wheeled suddenly on Peel, who had been quietly donning his webbing and ignoring the outbursts. "I'm telling you, Tomo, they've had me. Done. That's the whole damn thing. Balls to them." "No, then." Peel slung his rifle and picked up his pack. "Don't waste your breath telling me," he said. "Long John's just over the road. Go and tell him." He turned to the door, said, "We fall in 10 minutes, and went out, sensible man." "I'm not falling in." Forster bawled after him, and more curses followed, culminating in, "They can lock us away if they want to, I'm not going, and that's flat." "No, then." To my dismay, what he said, "Damn it," and turned to Grandmas. "What about you, old fellow?" That was the moment when I wished that Peel hadn't left, for while one could ignore Forster, what he was another matter, and Grandmas was wearing a lowering, sullen look I hadn't seen before. It was all nonsense, of course, no one was going to defy orders, and once Forster's spleen had spent itself all would be well, but at the time it was beginning to sound serious, Grandmas's silence being the most serious sign of all. "Aye, what say, then, Grandmas?" Forster sounded eager. "Come on, lad, what say?" Nick, who had not spoken until now, knocked out his pipe and got up. "Don't talk so bloody wet, Forster. You want to shut your mouth and give your backside a chance." "You," shouted Forster. "Get up to me, you mangy little sod, and I'll blitz you." "No, and I'm warning you." He let go another stream of filth, and suddenly I'd had enough of him. I was the non-commissioned officer, I'd probably been spoiling for a go at him ever since the Duke's burial, or perhaps I had a touch of fever, as many of us did at that time. Whatever the reason, and it was probably just that he was being so unbearably noisy and obscene, I raised my voice. "Shut your bloody trap, Forster. No one's listening." He looked at me in genuine astonishment. "What the hell's it got to do with you? You haven't got your bloody knees brown yet." "That did it. That's why I've got a stripe and you haven't," I said. "And I don't mind losing it for the pleasure of breaking your lousy neck. Leadership is an art, you see." "That's my old jock," crowed Parker. "Kick his nuts in. With my permission." He got no further because Forster called me a really disgusting name, and I went for him in a blind rage and landed a lethal right on the brim of his hat, at which point fortunately Nick and Parker draped themselves around me. I say fortunately because someone would certainly have gotten hurt, and it might well have been me. And as they were heaving me away, and Forster was spitting vengeance, Grandmas got to his feet and said in mild irritation, "Hold on a minute. I can't hear myself think." He stood staring at the floor, and then gave a great despondent sigh, "It's no bloody use. There's nothing we can do about it." He began to put on his equipment. Stanley picked up the Bren, and Watty, after a moment's hesitation, said, "Shite," and began to gather his gear together. I contented myself with saying, "Any time you like, Forster," and he told me to piss off, in a Pickwickian way, and a few minutes later we were falling in outside in the downpour, after another glorious anticlimax. To quote a phrase I learned from the late Bill Shankly when he was managing Carlisle United, everyone had talked a good game. Rangoon was never mentioned again, but it was a while before 9th Section got over their disappointment and returned to their normal state of belly-aching discontent. You can see their point. Within a week of Rangoon's fall came the news of Hitler's death and the German surrender. Crowds at home were giving way to the delirium of victory in Europe Day, and we were going back up the road to resume the debate with a Japanese enemy whom we'd hoped never to see again. I mentioned earlier the fiasco of the officer who announced the end of the European war just as we were about to start an attack. That could be laughed off, but the prospect of a longer haul was less amusing. The fact that the end was definitely in sight was a mixed consolation. As in a game, where there's a peculiar cruelty about losing a last-minute deciding goal, so it is in war. No one wants to buy it at any time, but it seems doubly hard to buy it late in the day, especially from an adversary who by any normal standards should have packed in long ago. For it was common knowledge now, even at rifle pit level, that as an organized force, the Japanese were finished. Their armies had been cut in two and scattered at Meiktilo, Pyobwe, and Mandalay, and when 5th and 17th Divisions began leapfrogging to Pegu, the last hope for the broken enemy was escape to Siam. Those to the east of the road could head south between the Salween and Sitang rivers, but those to the west, cut off by our drive to Pegu, could only take refuge in the jungly hills of the Pegu Yomas and wait for a chance to break across the road before heading south in turn. For the next 3 months, being Japanese and not knowing when he was beaten, he kept trying, and 14th Army kept getting in his way. By the end of that time he would be on his chinstrap, short of food, out of ammo, plagued with malaria, dysentery, jungle sores, and foul weather, and sometimes barely able to stand, let alone walk, but he was still dangerous, and he kept coming. I dare say Japanese historians regard the last phase of the Burma War as something best forgotten. Speaking as objectively as I can, I'd say that from what I saw of them, and what I heard, the remnants of the Japanese 15th, 28th, and 33rd Armies did their country proud. I shouldn't be surprised if some of them were still holed up around the Sitang Bend, waiting to die for their emperor. It's a time which I cannot hope to write about systematically because it lacks the big points of reference which I think of as milestones, and which have enabled me to give some narrative form, however erratic, to my story so far. With the help of written histories, I have been able to trace 9 sections progress through Meiktilo and Pyobwe to Pegu, but after that, there were no major actions for us, no obvious objectives, and for me, no plotted course to follow. For most of the time from May to August, we were engaged on the Rangoon Road and its surrounds, trying to stop the Japanese from breaking across it, which meant a deal of shuttling up and down, manning road stops, occupying outlying villages, laying ambushes which often came to nothing, constantly patrolling in search of Japanese forces and rumors of them, and getting wet enough to grow fins, for by now great stretches of the country were underwater. In those 3 months, the battalion shrank to about half its former size, through repatriation, bore a distinguished part in the final destruction of the Japanese 28th Army when it tried to make its big break across the road in late July, at which time I was with another unit, and accounted for 119 enemy dead in the last 2 weeks of the war. All this is a matter of record, but my memories of those 3 months are random and confused. I have plenty of my colored film strips, of incidents lasting anything from a few seconds to a few days, but there is not room for them all, and often I have no clear recollection of when or where they happened, or how they fitted into the overall scheme of things. I can only plead my erratic memory. When I consider the things I must have known and have forgotten, I can only shake my head. For example, at some point the battalion was reorganized into 3 new companies, and I don't even know which one I belonged to. 2 of the companies consisted of the longer-served men with low demobilization numbers who were due for repatriation. My demobilization number was 57, God help me, so presumably I was in the 3rd. I was sent on leave to Calcutta, but I can't remember when or the details of how I got there and back. On my return, I was detached to another unit because of my alleged specialist knowledge, and did not return to the battalion until just before Victory over Japan Day. So, having catalogued my deficiencies of memory, I shall record what I'm sure of. For some weeks after turning back from Pegu, we were in and around a godforsaken village on the Rangoon Road called Penwigon, foraying occasionally to outlying places, but always coming back to the section billet, which was a fine bungalow with a veranda, more or less surrounded by water. There I received from my father, God bless him, a copy of Bernard Ferguson's account of the Chindit expedition, Beyond the Chindwin, just the reading I didn't need, but Long John seemed to enjoy it. And it was on a patrol from Penwigon that Morton had hallucinations about midget Japanese commanded by Sir Walter Womersley, Minister of Pensions, and repulsed them with his cookery. We thought at the time that he was suffering a mild bout of jungle happiness, but it may have been fever. I had a touch of malaria at Penwigon and lost a couple of days out of my life. The medical officer, whom I shall call McMenemy, accused me of not taking my Mpacrine tablets, which was a military offense, but when I pointed out that, like everyone else, I was a rich yellow in color from swallowing the bloody things, he admitted grudgingly that they were not an infallible prophylactic. Half the section was feverish to some degree, and scoured by dysentery in its various forms. I'm crapping every color bar blue was Grandma's diagnosis. We blamed the monsoon, which certainly had one alarming effect, It puckered the skin in a revoltingly puffy fashion and brought forth a great plague of jungle sores on wrists and ankles. McMenemy painted them purple and gave us constipating drafts, and when the company radio picked up Bing Crosby singing, "And where will you take her, Reynaldo?" "I'll take her to San Pedro." "And where will she live in San Pedro?" "In my little house on the bay." It was immediately parodied as, "And where will you take him, McMenemy?" "I'll take him to the sick bay." "And what will he do in the sick bay?" "Eat macrine all bloody day." He was a good and popular medical officer, noted for going in with the troops in attacks, during one of which, on a village, he was observed running ahead with a rifle, hopefully crying, "Pig! Pig!" We were kept busy at Penwegon, but there was still time for occasional recreation. A makeshift cinema had been set up in a disused rice mill and showed 2 British films, Champagne Charlie and Noel Coward's This Happy Breed, both featuring Stanley Holloway. What British film of that time didn't? And even if most of the dialogue was inaudible, with hundreds of tons of monsoon water battering the roof, the screen images were welcome reminders of home for men sweating on repatriation. A few of 9's section preferred more esoteric diversions, like cockfighting, to which the villages of Penwegon were devoted, and which must be about the only cultural link between Burma and West Cumberland. I never saw a cockfight myself, but I remember Grandma's counting his rupees and crying, "Come on, Watty, are you coming to the main?" An expression I wouldn't have expected to encounter outside the pages of Georgette Heyer. But then, Cumbrians are a breed apart from the rest of England, in sport as in other things. Who else still wrestles on the green and whistles in the trail hounds from their fellside races and pursues foxes on foot for astonishing distances up and down the Lake Hills? Since the war, a Cumberland farmer has stood for Parliament on a platform for the legalization of cockfighting and the docking of horses' tails. He lost his deposit, but his election meetings were packed out, and he left behind one of the great parliamentary slogans, "Get the spurs out, and let's get cracking." Grandma's probably voted for him. It may have been at Penwegon, but I rather fancy it was at a road stop farther south and later on, that Corporal Peel received a deserved promotion to sergeant in another platoon, and since no corporal appeared to replace him, 9th section found themselves groaning under the iron heel of their lance corporal, a fate which they bore with commendable indifference, but which filled me with dismay, for this was responsibility, unpaid, too, and I didn't welcome my first independent exercise of it. Less than 10 miles from the road and running parallel with it lay the Sitang River, now a dread name in Japanese memory, since it saw the final extinction of their armies. Those from the north fled down along it, and for those to the west of the road, it was the Great Barrier as they tried to escape east. I don't think I was ever across it, but we patrolled towards and along its west bank, saw scores of enemy bodies, bloated and disfigured, coming down in the swift-flowing current, and from time to time set up temporary posts between it and the road. It was from one of these that I had my first taste of leading the section on patrol, probably sometime in late June or early July. We had a new platoon officer by this time, and he briefed me and other patrol leaders in a hut in a miserable hamlet not far from the west bank. I've forgotten his name, but not his moustache, which was luxuriant and apparently endowed with a life of its own, for it heaved and undulated even when he wasn't talking. Sergeant Hutton, who was taking another patrol, across the Sitang, I think, stood at his elbow as I was instructed to take the section to a village several miles down the river, settle in for the night, scout the country round the following day, wait overnight at the village, and come home the morning after. In the event of sighting or hearing of any significant Japanese activity, I was to send a runner back at speed and wait. It was routine stuff, but I was quite sure it was being entrusted to me only because there was no one more experienced to send. With the battalion short of officers and non-commissioned officers, and the platoon operating independently, the new subaltern was having to make do with what he had, and, doubtless on Hutton's advice, I was being given the cushiest of the 3 patrols, to an area where there was little likelihood of encountering the Japanese. The other hazard, Burmese bands engaged in the national pastime of brigandage, might be anywhere. The battalion had already had to deal with some of them. My chief worry was not the bandits out there, but the ones at my back. When you've just escaped from your teens, you have doubts about your ability to control and direct that kind of hard-bitten gang for 2 days in the field, there and back across 20-odd miles of rough country. However, the officer, who was possibly even more nervous than I was, seemed to take me for granted. He gave me a map and a compass and wished me luck, and Hutton cuffed my shoulder and said, "All right, son. Take time, stick with the river, and you'll be fine. Aye, and see if you can pick up a few eggs, eh?" He was a psychologist, was Hutton. The mention of eggs made it seem a less desperate venture, somehow. We struck across the country in the rain to the river, which twists and turns a good deal in those parts. Sticking to it, as Hutton had advised, Would add miles to our journey, but it was insurance against getting lost. The country was fairly open, but there were jungly patches, and I wanted to avoid them as much as possible, so I kept the brown oily flood in view. Before we'd gone more than a couple of miles, we had made contact with the enemy, only one of him, fortunately, a short, bespectacled figure festooned with equipment, hanging about disconsolately and looking thoroughly lost. Forster, who was on point, covered him, and the Japanese unslung his rifle and sat down. By the time I came up, Forster had relieved him of his watch and was rifling his pack. The Japanese sat blinking and looking wet. I had no Japanese beyond banzai and sayonara, and when Parker tried him in Chinese, he just gaped in a forlorn way. The contents of his pack suggested he was a medical orderly. Certainly, he was the least competent Japanese I'd ever seen. He looked about 16, and unlike most of his countrymen at that time, was carrying a fair bit of fat. There was nothing for it but to send him back to the platoon, where he would be passed on for interrogation, and I was tempted to detail Forster, my most insubordinate element, as escort, but he was too useful altogether, so I sent Wedge. They trudged off, the Japanese stolid and bandy-legged, with Wedge talking to him in Birminghamese. I said nothing about the watch, partly out of weakness, partly because while I disapprove of robbing prisoners, Forster had taken him and was entitled. We marched on, and after an hour came to our first obstacle, a shown, not marked on my map, which ran across our front and emptied into the main river. It was sluggish but deep, and I was just wondering whether to try it farther inland or swim across when Watty pointed out that there was a canoe-like craft beached on the bank where the two streams met. The Sitang, according to the Gazetteer, is unnavigable in this region, and I'm not arguing if its monsoon tributaries are anything to go by. The canoe made it across the Shong and back 3 times, but foundered on its final trip, and Parker and I had to flounder ashore. Fortunately, it wasn't far, and the current was even slower than it looked, possibly because, to quote the Gazetteer, the waters hereabout carry a great deal of silt in suspension. It was like wading through dirty custard. We squelched on along the bank, and as the rain slackened and the sun became visible through the mist and cloud across the river, my spirits rose. We'd taken a prisoner, such as he was, and the fact that he was alone suggested that there was no large Japanese presence in the neighborhood, or he'd have been with them. That left the dacoits, who were reported to be using discarded Japanese weapons in their attacks on villages, and I've no doubt that as we marched, I was remembering. Bo Da Thon was a warrior of old. His sword and his snider were bossed with gold. And reflecting that this was the very territory where he shot at the strong, and he slashed at the weak. From the Salween scrub to the Chindwin teak. He crucified noble, he sacrificed mean. He filled old ladies with kerosene. And the newspapers over the water cried. A patriot fights for his countryside. It had been one of my father's favorites. I could picture him reciting as he showed me how to maintain a campfire, Maasai fashion, feeding a log into the embers on a hillside in Glen Elvin. He had never imagined that the listening small boy would someday encounter the real thing. That happened when we reached the village just on nightfall. It lay on the far side of a jungly stretch through which a narrow track twisted and turned so abominably that I began to have visions of losing our way altogether. The track had an alarming habit of petering out in swamp or undergrowth, and we hacked and splashed, being bitten witless by leeches and mosquitoes. Once, we found the way blocked by a stream unlike any I've ever seen. It looked exactly like milk, and there were dark snake-like shapes moving in its depths. "Water snakes," said Grandmas. "Bastard things. Are they poisonous?" "I never found out," said Grandmas, "and I'm bloody sure I'm not going to now." So we turned aside until a tangle of roots and creepers enabled us to cross, plowed on into the undergrowth, and I was just starting to have pups at the prospect of bedding down in that green mess for the night when we came out of it and saw the lights of a village less than half a mile away. Watty scouted it and reported. "No Japs, but there are some funny-looking buggers in there, I'll tell you. There were 10 or 12 of them, Burmans all right, but not your average peasant. There were plenty of those, women, children, and old folk quietly going about their business, but my attention was fixed on the dirty dozen, taking their ease round a fire before the biggest basher in the place and looking like fantasy pirates, some with scarves round their heads, others in straw hats, and all bristling with enough assorted cutlery to start a shop, dars, swords, knives, and several undoubted Japanese rifles. They were dacoits, no question, but far from terrorizing the village, they seemed to belong to it, judging from the way the children were playing among them. No doubt the proper course would have been to disarm them and take them in for questioning, but I could think of 4 good reasons against it. There was nothing amiss but their villainous appearance, they weren't disturbing the peace, there were too many of them for comfort, and I'm not Sanders of the river. Also, they greeted us with the Burman's unfailing courtesy, rising as one man with nods and becks and evil grins, and I was wishing I knew the Burmese for good evening when the local headman appeared. He was a jovial old buck in a spotless white robe, a brass medal of George V on his imposing stomach, and a staff of office which he flourished in welcome. He spoke excellent English, ushered us to the fire, ordered up refreshments, and established his bona fides by singing Keep the Home Fires Burning in a thunderous baritone. He had learned it, he said, in France with the Burma Rifles in the First World War, and did an encore while his gang of cutthroats beat time and hummed along, offered us cheroots, passed the mangoes, and cast envious glances at our Bren gun. They were armed, the headman said, against possible attack by dacoits who were taking advantage of the troubled times to plunder far and wide. Several villages nearby had suffered from their depredations. He translated this into Burmese for the benefit of his other listeners, and the gang round the fire shook their heads in concern. Then, of course, there were the unspeakable Japanese, none of whom, fortunately, were in the vicinity at present, but if we wanted any help in slaughtering stragglers, his lads would be charmed to assist, in return for a few grenades and any spare small arms we might have about us. It was so reassuring that I didn't sleep a wink, not that I could have even if I'd wanted to, for we all bedded down on mats on the long veranda of the headman's house with his numerous family, Granny being discreetly positioned between the brutal soldiery and the younger females, and she snored like the last trump. What with that and being eaten alive by mosquitoes and my suspicions of the bandits in the next basha, I spent most of the night pacing the village street in my monsoon cape, reflecting that if I had studied just a little harder, I would have been snug in student digs in Hillhead with nothing to worry about but lectures and exams in anatomy, and just that thought was enough to make my present lot seem very heaven, wet and mosquito-plagued though it might be. There would be time enough for desk work and the humdrum business of making a living in civilian life, and then this little outpost at the back of beyond would be like a dreamland, long ago and far away. How many times, in the late 40s and 50s, did one see a sober citizen in his office throw aside his pencil and stare at the window and exclaim, "Oh God, I wish the war was still on." It is a strange echo now. Who could possibly want to be at war? Nobody in his right mind, and of course the sober citizen wasn't longing for battle and sudden death, but remembering the freedom of service life, the strange sights and smells of places just like this, the uncertainty of tomorrow, and the romance of distant lands and seas. They have their hazards, but once you've trodden the wild ways you never quite get them out of your system. You never get malaria out of it, either, and while mine hasn't troubled me for years, that's no fault of the buzzing pests which infested that village in their billions. By morning my face was swollen beyond recognition, and most of the section, and the younger villagers, had been badly bitten. Granny and the older generation, being made of leather, were apparently Anopheles proof. She clucked in dismay at my appearance and gave me a fine old herbal, I hope it was herbal, ointment to rub on, which if anything made it worse. The armed Burmese had slipped away during the night, the headman was nowhere to be seen, and I didn't know whether to be worried or not. The hell with them. My hated Tommy gun had collected another fine patina of rust in the soggy atmosphere, and I oiled and cursed over it while Grandmas bargained for provisions with the villagers, airing his Burmese with jet ulo yinda? Which means have you any eggs? They inquired by signs how many he wanted, which was what he'd been waiting to be asked for weeks. He beamed and cried, "Shit," which is the word for 8. Needless to say, he went on to purchase 8 cheroots and 8 mangoes and 8 bananas. Any other number would have seemed tame to him. We scouted in a 2-mile arc beyond the village without seeing a soul, or anything but misty plain and scrub. We brewed up at noon in the shelter of a palm grove, and were making our way back reluctantly for another night in Mosquito City when we hit on something that altered the whole nature of the patrol. In a ramshackle basha hidden away in a little shone, we surprised 4 Indian soldiers in their underclothes. Their uniforms and equipment were gone, but 2 of them still had rifles which they snatched up at the sight of us, only to drop them as hurriedly when we covered them. There was no doubt what they were, GIFs, deserters to the Japanese. One of them, who seemed to be the leader, had a little Japanese pamphlet on him, which might have been some sort of identity card, but in answer to questions they stubbornly pretended not to understand, which was nonsense. An Indian soldier with absolutely no English at all was a rare bird. My Urdu was good enough to ask their names, ranks, and regiments, but all I got was a blank stare. They just weren't talking. The question was what to do with them, and Forster had the answer. "Shoot the buggers," said he. "Don't be a bloody idiot," I snapped, all the angrier for not knowing what to do next. "I'm not the bloody idiot," he retorted. "What are you going to do with them, then?" That was the difficulty. If there had been 1 or even 2 of them, we could have kept them prisoners through the night and the next day of the patrol, but 4 was too many, even disarmed. They were dead men when the army got them, a court-martial would see to that, and they knew it. They would certainly try something, And God alone knew what that might lead to. And I didn't know what to do. The crisis had come in a totally unexpected form. Grandma suddenly thrust one of them against the wall and put his bayonet to his throat. "Who the hell are you, you bastard?" he shouted, and the man just glared and closed his mouth tight. "He's a bloody jiff," said Forster. "They're worse than the bloody Japs. Shoot the buggers, I say." "Christ, I'll do it." "Shut up, or you're under arrest," I said, which is the weak non-commissioned officer's last resort, but I was rattled and couldn't see the simple, obvious solution. It had all happened too quickly, and I could only look at the 4 brown faces in silence, for no one else was saying a word. They were ordinary Jawans, skinny and helpless looking in their shorts and singlets. How they'd lost their uniforms, when they'd deserted, what they were doing there, I still don't know. They were watching me, ugly and sullen, but not scared. Of course, shooting them was out of the question, but listening to the silence, I had a horrid feeling that if I did give the unthinkable order, the section would obey it, Forster for certain, Watty and Morton probably, perhaps even Grandmas and Nick. They might not do it themselves, but they would not object to its happening. If you think that atrocious, well, it is, by civilized lights, but they don't shine much in wartime. They mustn't, or you'll lose. The section were hard men, used to killing as a matter of course, and these were traitors who wouldn't have hesitated if the positions had been reversed. I may be wrong, but I'm pretty sure those jiffs would have been dead if I'd given the word I had no intention of giving. I'd heard the section, only a week or so earlier, discussing the deaths of some Japanese soldiers who'd been found asleep in a basha out towards the Pegu Yomas. The soldier who'd found them had woken them up, and then shot them, and the feeling of 9 section had been that it didn't matter, but on the whole, he had done the proper thing because it wasn't right to shoot men asleep. "Are we going to serve them or not?" challenged Forster, looking around, and Parker spoke for the first time. "Can't keep them overnight, Corporal," and the last word made it plain that he was leaving it to me. He regarded me impassively, the old professional. Then he added, "Can't shoot them, either," and I knew the relief of not being alone. "What for not?" demanded Forster. "They're bloody jiffs, man," said Watty. "Who's going to look after them?" Grandmas was addressing me. "We'll take them in today," I said, voicing the conclusion I'd have reached earlier if I'd had my wits about me. "We can have them back before dark." "What about the patrol? I thought we were meant to go back tomorrow." "I'll worry about that," I said, and that settled it. We tied their hands with log lines, and I went outside and took a bearing to get us home by the shortest route. Forster had to have the last word. "If they'd been bloody Japs," he announced loudly, "we'd never have thought twice. Bloody jiffs. I don't know. It may seem that I am making much of a trivial incident or trying to show how enlightened a Christian I was. I'm not enlightened and believe that the best way with enemies is the short one, and at least part of the reason for not letting Forster have his way was that I'd have been called to account, and probably court-martialed, when the story got out, as it inevitably would. But although it had been a 30-second crisis at most, it had been a vital moment for me. I can look back now and say that there was only one possible outcome, but for half a minute I'd felt the weight, and I never knew any doubts about being in command again. Coming home on a straight line, we hit the Shong about a mile from the river and found it shallow enough to wade. Once the rain stops, water levels can fall at astonishing speeds. We ran into a Balak patrol who were coming out as we returned, and from the looks directed at our prisoners, it was plain that the jiffs had been lucky to be taken by a British unit. We reached the platoon area as night fell, and to my relief, the subaltern approved my decision to cut the patrol short. Sergeant Hutton was less impressed. He obviously considered Grandmas's eggs a poor haul. I was just glad it was over, and that I was carrying a Lee Enfield again. I had appropriated one of the 2 taken from the jiffs, and my Tommy gun has long since rusted away at the bottom of a tributary to the Sitang. Polling in the 1945 general election took place between July 5 and 12 and resulted in an overwhelming defeat for Churchill and the Conservatives at the hands of the Labour Party, an outcome which astonished the world, but not the British Army. Servicemen under the age of 21 were not entitled to vote. "Hey Grandmas, how do you spell Iredell?" "How the hell do I know? Who's Iredell?" "Liberal candidate in Carlisle. I'm writing home to see what he's on about." "Well, I don't belong to bloody Carlisle. I belong to Penrith, and I don't know what constituency it's in, and I don't care because I'm not voting, either." "You ought to vote, man." "What for? The Labour man doesn't stand a bloody chance, and I'm damned if I'll vote Tory. Them buggers have been in too long." "Well, vote Liberal, then." "Get lost. I don't know a damn thing about politics, but I know the Liberals called Roberts, And his family's temperance, so damn them. They had a cellar out at Naworth, bursting with the best drink in the county, and the teetotal buggers poured the lot of it down the drain. Think I'd vote for them? Man, they say if you come up at Brampton Court the first thing old Robert says is, was there a smell of drink about the accused, constable? And if the constable says your worship, he was pissed rotten, then you've had it. Sod them. You don't deserve the vote, you. Does anybody know how to spell Iredell? Give over, man, you're wasting your time. They'll never put a Liberal in for Carlisle. It'll be old General Spears, the Tory. Him that was in the desert with Lawrence of Arabia. He's been telling folk there are 20 million Arabs waiting on the result of the Carlisle election. Daft bugger. They reckon he'll get back, though. Not if I can help it. I'm bloody voting Labour, and I don't give a monkey's left ball who the candidate is. It can be bloody George Formby, he'll get my vote. Reckon Labour'll give you your job back on the buses, Forster? Bugger the buses. I want Churchill out, and his whole damn gang. I remember the 30s, mate, if you don't. I want rid of the bloody Tories, see, and the la-dee-dahs, and the lot of them. They got us into this bloody war, didn't they? Well, I'm voting Labour to get rid of bloody old Womersley. I reckon we'll be better with Labour. Get away, it'll make no bloody difference, not to the working man, anyhow. Them that's better off will still be better off, no matter who gets in. Who's the Labour man in Carlisle, Forster? I've just been telling you, I don't know. But he's getting the nod from me, anyway. His name's Edgar Grierson. What, him that worked in the co-op? He won't get many votes in Stanwix. How the hell do you know, Jock? You're not old enough to vote, you. That's right, Forster. I just know who the candidates are. You big grown-ups will decide who the government is. You're bloody right we will. Well, I'm glad you haven't got the vote, Jock, because you'd just vote Tory, wouldn't you, you that wants to be an officer? No, I'd vote for Edgar Grierson. Get away. I can see you. Why'd you vote Labour, Jock? Shut up, Forster. Why, man? Because my father's Edgar's doctor, and he used to take me to football when I was small. You're small yet, sonny boy. And Mrs. Grierson made bloody good high teas. Typical. That's your educated man, gramass. Voting with his bloody belly. So you vote for him, Forster. He's all right, and a bloody sight more honest than most politicians. He was in this regiment, too, in the Great War. What? A bloody officer. Bollocks to him, then. No, private. In the trenches. He'll do me, then. Bugger them and their class distinction. They voted with high hopes, for a better, fairer Britain, and to some extent they got it. Mostly it was a vote to get them out, them being not just the Conservatives, but all that it was believed they stood for, wealth and privilege and authority as personified by civilian employers and army officers, who, I suspect, were as likely to vote Labour as Tory, especially the younger men. It was a strange election for me, old enough to lead a section in war, but not old enough to vote. I had no complaints. I wasn't fit to vote for I took no interest in politics, and my support for Grierson, who got in, I'm delighted to say, and Westminster never saw a better man, was entirely personal. Mind you, better that than voting for a party. And the truth was that while I knew how to be a soldier and had some idea of how to lead a section, I knew nothing of working for a living, of being a farm labourer, or a factory hand, or being on the dole, or being fired for crossing my hands on the wheel. No, it was their election, not mine. They had earned it. With the exception of Parker, who I suspect voted Tory if he voted at all, freelancers are a conservative lot, and one or two of the rustics, who may have voted Liberal, they were Labour to a man, but not necessarily socialists as the term is understood now. Their socialism was of a simple kind. They had known the 30s, and they didn't want it again, the dole queue, the street corner, the true poverty of that time. They wanted jobs, security, and a better future for their children than they had had, and they got that and were thankful for it. It was what they had fought for, over and beyond the pressing need of ensuring that Britain did not become a Nazi slave state. Still, the Britain they see in their old age is hardly the land fit for heroes that they envisaged. If that land existed in their imaginations, it was probably a place where the pre-war values coexisted with decent wages and housing. It was a reasonable, perfectly possible dream, and for a time it existed, more or less. And then it changed, in the name of progress and improvement and enlightenment, which meant the destruction of much that they had fought for and held dear, and the betrayal of familiar things that they had loved. Some of them, to superficial minds, will seem terribly trivial, even ludicrously so, things like county names, and shillings and pence, and the King James Version, and yards and feet and inches, yet they matter to a nation. They did not fight for a Britain which would be dishonestly railroaded into Europe against the people's will. They did not fight for a Britain where successive governments, by their weakness and folly, would encourage crime and violence on an unprecedented scale. They did not fight for a Britain where thugs and psychopaths could murder and maim and torture and never have a finger laid on them for it. They did not fight for a Britain whose leaders would be too cowardly to declare war on terrorism. They did not fight for a Britain whose parliament would, time and again, betray its trust by legislating against the wishes of the country. They did not fight for a Britain where children could be snatched from their homes and parents by night on nothing more than the good old Inquisition principle of secret information. They did not fight for a Britain whose churches and schools would be undermined by fashionable reformers. They did not fight for a Britain where free choice could be anathematized as discrimination. They did not fight for a Britain where to hold by truths and values which have been thought good and worthy for 1,000 years would be to run the risk of being called fascist. That, really, is the greatest and most pitiful irony of all. No, it is not what they fought for, but being realists, they accept what they cannot alter and reserve their protests for the noise pollution of modern music in their pubs. That concludes the 10th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please consider subscribing for more episodes.